Silent inflammation is the root of so many chronic health issues, from fatigue and weight gain to anxiety and autoimmune disease. In this episode, I'll explain what inflammation really is, how to recognize it, and steps you can take to calm the fire inside your body. The word inflammation is something that most of us now recognize. Over my 20 years in practice in the integrative and functional medicine space, I am actually super happy that this is a word that people don't scratch their heads about anymore. But we are all inflamed. And we are inflamed in different ways. And it's not just the big autoimmune disease or the scary diagnoses of cancer or heart disease or any of those. There's silent inflammation happening within us each and every day. And unfortunately, many of the conditions and symptoms and even how we present in day-to-day life are a reflection of this silent inflammation. When I talk about inflammation and all of us being inflamed, I'm talking about the hum of cortisol, the stress hormone that's traveling throughout our body day in and day out, 24-hour rhythm, coming down through time and keeping us in a chronic state of inflammation. Cortisol comes from lots of different places. Most of you may hear the word cortisol and think stress. Well, she's talking about the stress response, and I am. But there's acute stress where something major happens, or you have a deadline, or you have some trauma, or you have something that's happened that you can explain. And that does create a cortisol response. It triggers inflammation, it triggers high blood sugar, and it keeps us, sometimes it acts even, as the tipping point for many different diseases. Those grandiose entries of cortisol and inflammation may lead to the diagnosis of different diseases. But that's not what we're talking about today. In this episode, I want to break down this idea of silent inflammation, the cortisol hum, how we are all inflamed, and is there anything that we can do about it? Welcome to Whole Plus, the podcast that embraces and tackles the holistic way, bringing it all together: science, research, innovations in technology, and our collective human experience. This is where science and spirit come together. I'm Dr. Taz, your host and a double board certified medical doctor, an integrative health expert, a nutritionist, and an acupuncturist. I'm also the founder and CEO of Whole Plus, a digital and clinical platform where my team and I practice evidence-based holistic medicine every single day. I know and I hear all the health and wellness noise that's out there. I want this show to be the one to empower you with the knowledge you need to heal not just your body, but your relationships, your communities, and our world. Welcome to Whole Plus. Silent inflammation can begin when we're not even aware of it. It can tie back to the prenatal environment. It can tie to how our early childhood played out, everything from the food we ate, the amount of stress we were exposed to, amount of television, environmental toxins, electronics, you name it, but inflammation being influenced by so many different inputs all around us. What's even more fascinating and interesting is there is now talk that some of this might actually be intergenerational. We have yet to prove it, but so many studies are starting to understand that inflammation can actually be coded in your DNA, in your mitochondria, and transmitted down generation after generation, as can your stress response. In 2017 or 2018, I did a TED Talk talking about this, and it was fascinating to me at the time reviewing the literature and the science that talked about the maternal or the mitochondrial DNA. Remember, the mitochondria sits in the cell. It's the powerhouse of a cell, and it's usually maternally inherited, passed down generation after generation. When they study where emotions and thoughts are coded, they often find that it is coded in the mitochondria. And in turn, that cortisol response is coded there as well. So sit back and think about that for just a second. We talk about inflammation in so many different contexts, right? We talk about it in the context of an anti-inflammatory diet or anti-inflammatory herbs and supplements. We love our curcumin or our boswellia, all these different things that seem to turn the body around and calm the immune system down. But how much do we really talk about inflammation and cortisol in the context of mitochondrial DNA and intergenerational habits and patterns? And that is what science is slowly starting to prove. We're starting to understand that under stress or under trauma, there are actually changes to our genetic code, and that those genetic code changes are then handed down over time, generation after generation. If the stress of each generation is cumulative, well, then there are more genetic changes. And that in turn changes what happened when you arrived. If you were born in an environment where your mom or her ancestors experienced incredible stress, well, that prenatal environment is already more susceptible for you to develop inflammation. We see it in studies that are kind of one off, right? When we talk about PCOS, for example, they now know that PCOS is connected to high androgens, and the high androgens are connected to high cortisol. And a lot of that is present as early as a prenatal in utero environment. And then as you walk through life, it only exaggerates. So sometimes you can say we are all inflamed because we've all come from a lineage of stress and inflammation and trauma. And it's only exaggerated when we add to it the environment of today. So let's move forward just a little bit. Even if we are walking around with inherited genetic changes or a predisposition to stress and cortisol, you might be thinking, well, I can't do anything about that. And you're right to a point. But let's keep moving because beyond that, childhood today, teenage today, and adulthood today looks very different than it did 50 years ago. There are hits to your inflammatory load from all kinds of places. Your toxic load is higher than it has been in the past. We know that endocrine disruptors, glyphosate, phthalates, so many different chemicals exist today in larger amounts than they did even 2 decades ago. We also understand that food quality is changing and going down, adding to our inflammatory load. We understand, too, that the environment is not only changing, but how we live is changing. We are indoors more, not in nature, surrounded by light and blue light, disrupting and impacting our circadian rhythms. That also triggers inflammation. And as we've grown and modernized and become a more technological society, we're also becoming more isolated. The nuclear family sometimes has shrunk even further down. And in that isolation and lack of community, we continue to stay inflamed because community lowers cortisol. And our relationships help us to stay in a lower stress or stress-free environment as long as they're healthy. So this idea of cyclical inflammation or generational inflammation is predisposing all of us to staying inflamed. And then come the hits. So it's almost like we're walking into the situation already not at 100%. And now the hits start coming. And like all autoimmune diseases, the silent hum of cortisol and inflammation, coded over time and throughout maybe your childhood and your early adulthood, is the setup and the precipice for a full-blown disease. There are many diseases of inflammation today: cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease, cardiometabolic diseases, mental health diseases, all of them hallmarks of inflammation. But what if we could prevent it all? And what if we could act on silent inflammation even earlier than before we started to notice symptoms and conditions? How amazing would that be, where we could actually rewrite the script? We could flip it and turn it around so that we don't have to live out a story of inflammation and high cortisol that maybe those that came before us did. Big inflammation, right? Chronic inflammation, the one that I diagnose in the exam room, the one that gives me a high CRP, a high SED rate, a high TGF beta, high interleukin 6. That stuff is easy to spot, at least easy for me. Should be easy for you. The symptoms of big inflammation, as I'm going to call it, the grandiose, dramatic inflammation, are everything from joint pain, brain fog, rashes that you can't explain, fatigue or chronic fatigue, even depression and anxiety, all symptoms of inflammation. Changes in your weight are often one of the first hallmark signs of ongoing inflammation. Disruptions in your gut health and your overall hormone health, all of it a sign of inflammation. Many times that's what drives you into the exam room, and you show up ready to understand what's going on. Others, you might ignore it and wait for the actual diagnoses. Either way, that inflammation is more tactical, maybe more tangible, maybe something we can understand and even measure a little bit more easily. But remember, we're already walking around inflamed. We're all inflamed. And what we do want to understand in more depth is what are those silent symptoms of inflammation? There's an autoimmune disease that is becoming an epidemic among us, and that disease is called autoimmune hypothalamitis, and its symptom is high cortisol and inflammation. Some of the subtle signs and symptoms of this are showing up in your everyday life, and you're simply not aware of it. They're showing up in your personality, your irritability, your anxiety, your inability to connect to somebody else, your desire to withdraw and to isolate. Many of these are signs of silent inflammation. They're showing up in your gut health and your hormone health. It could be simply not feeling good after a meal, bloating, or reflux. It could also be things like missing periods, not having the energy that you normally do, or for many of our men today, having trouble building muscle or gaining muscle. They're showing up in our brains where we can't focus and concentrate. Why are so many of our children on ADD and ADHD medications? What's happening there? It's almost like the brain can't handle the load that it's expected to perform at today. These are all signs of silent inflammation. This cortisol hum and this silent inflammation can make you not take a risk or a chance on something that you might have. And it can prevent you from getting pregnant or building the family that you always wanted. But to understand silent inflammation, it takes a little bit more work than a standard lab panel and understanding and checking the boxes off typical inflammatory markers. We have to start thinking about ourselves as all susceptible to this idea of hypothalamitis, where we are inflamed from the start, and now we need to work proactively to reduce it and to minimize it. That's where autoimmune hypothalamitis comes into the picture. And it helps us to understand silent inflammation in the context of not just a cortisol hum or an intergenerational issue or an environmental issue or food issue, but really how the entire nervous and hormone system and inflammatory and immunology cascade work together. Now, that's a lot. So I want you to take a second to process all of that we are essentially tying together what has happened before you with what happened during your childhood, with the environment that you're now walking into, and weaving it together and understanding now that so many people, before they get a diagnosis of a chronic disease, already have a disease called hypothalamitis. And I want to take a second to help you understand what that is and visualize what that is. So when I use the word hypothalamus, what in the world are we talking about? So the hypothalamus is a section of the brain. It sits literally right here behind the pineal gland, buried deep, but hooked up with the pituitary gland. The two almost work together, and it's so important for you to visually understand this. And here's the reason why. All of these guys are interconnected. The pineal gland is receiving light, telling us when to sleep, when to wake, regulating melatonin. Melatonin regulates insulin, and right behind it is this hypothalamus and pituitary. The hypothalamus is your sensor. I always equate it to like the shark's fin. It's running around in the environment, sensing your temperature, your mood, what's going on, and is there a danger? Is there anything in the environment that we need to be aware of? That's your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is conscious of what to do in a moment or in a situation and regulates your fight or flight response. Now, right next to your hypothalamus, again, is that pituitary gland. And that pituitary is responsible for secreting the hormones that regulate production of hormones from all the different end organs of the body, your ovaries, your uterus, your thyroid, your adrenal glands, you name it. So we've got the hypothalamus sensing everything, the pineal gland taking light and input in, and then the pituitary regulating hormones, but it also regulates your neurotransmitters. So that's your dopamine, your serotonin, and your GABA. So they're almost like this on-off switch is probably the best way to think about it. Hypothalamus alerts, the pituitary starts to act. Pituitary pumps out cortisol and adrenaline and all these stress hormones. Those stress hormones influence all the other hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and the secretion of those. And this circuit kind of works together on and off and up and down, protecting one another and deciding what's going to happen with the physiology, with the biochemistry of your body. Think about what that means. That means, first of all, that a single stressor is impacting the nervous system in its entirety, and also maybe impacting your hormones. The two are so intertwined. So when we are all inflamed, and when we've undergone assault after assault after assault, whether it is as a child or in utero or intergenerationally, that hypothalamus is already on alert. You may be 3 years old and your hypothalamus is on alert. You may be 50 years old and that hypothalamus is on alert. And that chronic state of cortical activation or being on alert or in fight mode or flight mode keeps us all inflamed, even when you're trying to pursue diet and supplements and lifestyle modifications. If we're not dealing with this central area of the brain that's working together and chronically deciding, really commanding what's going on with the rest of the body, we're doing the body a disservice. There are a lot of specific examples that I can give you, and a lot of things we can't explain in medicine that I think can be explained by this particular pattern, by this particular disease. The conventional approach to looking at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is to check traditional markers, whether those are hormones or even looking at neurotransmitter markers, and then deciding what's deficient or what's in excess, and then kind of going from there. Here are some classic signs and symptoms if you looked it up in a medical textbook. For example, your blood pressure is determined by the hypothalamus. Your fluid shifts, whether you're retaining water or dehydrated, is also determined. Have you ever looked at somebody who's super stressed and they just look puffy? Well, that's why the hypothalamus is driving that. Things like infertility, again, driven by the hypothalamus. And in addition to that, delayed puberty or even precocious puberty that we're seeing a lot of today, muscle weakness, sleep disturbances, temperature regulation, all of it associated with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamic activation is connected to PCOS and androgen sensitivity, and it's also now connected to the drop in testosterone that we're seeing in men. So maybe those are easier to diagnose, right? But when we are all inflamed and we have silent inflammation, many of us live in the gray zone, the zone where the labs don't really tell us very much, but we know something's off. Or maybe our subconscious knows that something's off. Here are a few signs and symptoms. Personality changes. If you've gone from being, and this is across every age, by the way, a happy-go-lucky child, now fearful or anxious, that's a sign they've got hypothalamic activation. Someone who was relatively comfortable in social situations and now has social anxiety, hypothalamic activation, hypothalamitis. Fatigue, even if it's low grade, not showing up for activities, not being able to perform the way you once were, again, a sign of hypothalamic activation. As is changes in sex drive, skipping period, excessive thirst. These are all signs, more subtle signs of inflammation in the hypothalamus. Once we recognize that the hypothalamus is driving a lot of our symptoms of inflammation as we experience it today, then we can actually start to build a plan to reverse all of this. But first is the recognition. And the reason I wanted to do this episode and call attention to this is because I feel like we have a lot of plans for a lot of different things, but we don't understand that we have to take cortical activation down at the level of the hypothalamus and at the level of the pituitary to truly embark on a healing journey. When we don't do that and we're sort of like taking this for inflammation and taking that for hormone balance and, randomly doing things and not incorporating this critical piece of it, then we don't truly recover 100%. And true healing happens when the nervous system and the hypothalamus calm down. I want you guys to remember that. True healing happens when we can get that hypothalamic pituitary axis to calm down. So we need all of it to work together. So let's start to build a model where that can actually happen, rather than it seeming like something so intangible that it's not realistic to do. So it begins with, first of all, a certain amount of awareness that this is going on, and this is something that we need to deal with. And it does now begin in a slightly different way than many of the other medical conditions we've talked about on this show. We still think gut health is important. We still think an anti-inflammatory diet is important. Optimizing nutrients are important. All of those things still hold in building a toolbox to tackle autoimmune hypothalamitis. But here's what's different. We have to actively work on lowering cortisol. and lowering down hypothalamic cortical activation. And the way to do that is conscious resting, which is so difficult to do. And conscious resting, when we're talking about it with silent inflammation, is not scrolling on your phone. It's not even watching a show. It's going into those deeper healing states, the type of states that maybe the Buddhist monks go into or your shamans and your healers go into. Because in those deep, deep states of healing, that's where the brain resets. And that's where you flip the switch onto intergenerational trauma and cortical activation. What that means is that you have to prioritize and almost pursue this type of healing. We have to bring the nervous system back into alignment. So now the priorities become deep, consistent sleep. Are you or your child or anybody in your family getting at least 90 minutes of deep sleep and 90 minutes of REM sleep? Are we resetting cortisol at the level of the hypothalamus? What are you doing to force your nervous system to relax? That means now we have budgets around how much time we can be in blue light or in light in general, and increased budgets about being in nature, off phones, off devices, to really absorb nature and its rhythms, which help to bring cortisol activation down. In addition to that, we have to pursue modalities that calm the nervous system down at that deep hypothalamic layer. Sound baths are one of my favorites. I don't know if you guys have ever tried one of these, but they instantly bring the nervous system back into balance, and they instantly bring some calmness. The frequencies will change what's happening with cortical activation in the brain. Modalities like Shriyadhara, which is fascinating, or even now the more modern version of the head spa, where you are forcing that nervous system to relax in these command centers. Again, a great way to gradually bring cortisol down. Another way to do it at home is to, again, oil the scalp or massage the scalp, and definitely massage right here between your third eye. These are all ways to change the chemistry and the biochemistry of what's happening through here. And one of the greatest tools is meditation. But meditation over a period of time is what ultimately changes what's going on at the level of the hypothalamus. It can start with 5 minutes and go to 10 minutes, and then ultimately trying to even get to about a half an hour a day. It's an incredible way to literally put water on a fiery brain. All of these are strategies to help calm inflammation down at the level of the hypothalamus, and in turn reset every other system in the body. But as you can imagine, this is not something that happens in a day or even in a month. This is something that happens over time and is gradual. But with consistency and effort, we can see the changes. You see it because your emotions change, your personality changes, your energy changes, your hormones re-regulate. Have you ever talked to somebody who's re-regulated their hormones through meditation? That's what I'm talking about. It's happened to me once where I, for the first time, had 3 consecutive weeks off. And my entire issue with my hormones and my hair reset in those 3 weeks because I was in the sun, I was sleeping deeply, I was happy, had no stress around me, and it was literally like a switch was flipped and everything reset. So for anyone out there who is struggling with their health and is trying everything but nothing is working, I want you to think about this as a potential diagnosis. Remember that you may have entered whatever health equation or relationship equation or work equation already inflamed, already cortically activated. And as life happens and as things happen, you may be pushed as a tipping point into a diagnosis of some kind. And you can change it by doing all the things you're already doing. But if you're missing thinking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary locked together, working together in synergy, trying to reset your health, we're missing a really important piece of the puzzle. And that could be your block in your healing journey to getting better. So whether it's sound baths or yoga or meditation or deep breathing or hyperbaric therapy, whatever the modality, we want to pursue the ability to get the nervous system to relax at the level up here, not just lower and beyond. So we are all inflamed because our ancestors, our lineages have all gone probably through something indescribable, something they can't explain or verbalize. And the genetics with each passing generation have changed. But it's our responsibility now to own that, understand that, and to flip that code so that we can then pass on healthier genetics to future generations, but more importantly, set ourselves up to be less inflamed and healthier, more energetic, and a more vibrant version of ourselves, not just for us, but for the families and the communities that we live in as well. If this episode spoke to you, share it with someone who needs it, subscribe for more, and check wholeplus.co for free resources to start your healing journey.